Thank you very much, and thank you for the Green Crescent for inviting me. It's a really great conference. So I work for a human rights NGO, the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, that is based in Budapest, but I also represent here the Eurasian Harm Reduction Network, which is a network of more than 500 organizations from Eastern, Central Europe, and Central Asia. And it aims is to promote harm reduction. So why harm reduction is so important? As a panelist yesterday mentioned, one of the major driving force behind the global HIV/AIDS epidemic is the sharing of needles and syringes, the sharing of injecting equipment among injecting drug users. So every third new HIV infections outside of sub-Saharan Africa is associated with injecting drug use. HIV is already decreasing among the general population in the world, but it's still increasing among injecting drug users. And the main reason is that, according to the recommendations of the United Nations, the only cost-effective way to prevent infections among drug users is harm reduction, that is needle exchange programs, for example, so providing sterile equipment to drug users and counseling, and also medically assisted treatment, for example, buprenorphine and methadone maintenance programs. The big problem is that if it comes to the access to harm reduction programs, there are still a lot of barriers to accessing these programs. For example, there is an excellent report produced by the International Drug Policy Consortium, the International HIV/AIDS Alliance, and Harm Reduction International. It's called the Funding Crisis for Harm Reduction. And this report points out that in 2010, it was estimated that worldwide, just 2 needles and syringes were distributed per person who injects drugs per month. This is not enough to stop the epidemic. And in the same year, only 8% of injecting drug users had access to medically assisted treatment, opiate substitution treatment. And only 4% of people who inject drugs and live with HIV received antiretroviral treatment for HIV. So there are very significant barriers. And the UNAIDS estimates that $2.3 billion is required to fund HIV prevention programs among injecting drug users, but only $160 million is actually invested in harm reduction. That means that only 7% of what is needed is actually spent on these programs. In those countries where harm reduction programs are well embedded into the treatment system, the epidemic could be effectively stopped, but in those countries where there are no harm reduction programs, we can still see rapidly growing trends in HIV infections. One of the big problems with the funding of harm reduction programs is that most funding is coming from international donors. So it's not the national governments who pay for harm reduction programs, but the international donors, especially the Global Fund to fight AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. So the Global Fund is the biggest investor in HIV prevention among injecting drug users in the world. Between 2002 and 2009, the Global Fund invested $263 million US dollars only in Eastern Europe and Central Asia to harm reduction programs. But now this situation is getting worse because international donors are retreating from these countries. The Global Fund introduced a new funding mechanism which base funding on the income level of countries. So it will allocate its resources to low-income countries. But most injecting drug users live in middle-income countries. So now all these programs that were set up in the previous decade funded by the Global Fund now are in danger. They faced an uncertain future. On the next slide, you can see that in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia, there are only 2 countries where there is a significant national fund on harm reduction programs. It's Georgia and Kazakhstan, and in all other countries, most of the harm reduction programs are funded by international donors. So advocacy for these NGOs who provide harm reduction programs has a key importance, because they have to convince their national governments to replace international donors, and they have to provide adequate funds for harm reduction programs. So the Eurasian Harm Reduction Network launched a campaign this year, which is called the Harm Reduction Works Funded. And this campaign the message of this campaign is to show that harm reduction programs are very effective in preventing HIV, in preventing overdoses, and it aims to strengthen advocacy by civil society, including for example, the clients of services of harm reduction, so community-based organizations in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In the framework of this campaign, mini grants will be provided to community-based organizations in 5 countries, that is Belarus, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, and Moldova, in a 3-year period, to build capacities for them, to train them, to use advocacy, and to organize regional and country-level forums to discuss harm reduction challenges and barriers of harm reduction with policy makers. Actually, the first meeting was held in the capital of Moldova in May this year. So this was the meeting where the campaign was officially started, and more than 150 participants attended this conference, where the grants for mini-grant proposals were announced. One of the central theme of this campaign is also female drug users, women who use drugs, because we think that female drug users are specifically vulnerable group inside drug users. Female drug users often have specific problems and needs, and most services only aim at male drug users, and they don't really address the needs of women who use drugs. And of course, women who use drugs often engage in prostitution, and they fell victim to violence, domestic violence, and also police abuse. So EHRN created an online map where women drug users can upload their own stories about their own problems and needs, and for example, cases of abuse. And this is a way how EHRN would like to raise awareness on the specific needs of women. A very powerful tool to tell stories of drug-dependent people is video, making films. Now it's a very easy and cost-effective way to reach out young people through the internet. There are video sharing websites where you can reach out video messages with a very short video. You can reach out a huge audience, young people now watching a lot of videos on YouTube. So my organization has produced more than 500 short videos since 2007. We have an online film database, so we are producing videos about various issues, drug policy. We have education movies and different kind of advocacy videos. If you go to our website, which is drugreporter.net, you can find this online video database, and we have every year we produce a film report. If you try to use videos as an advocacy tool, you always have to keep in mind what is the goal of your video. Is it to educate? Is it to mobilize people? Is it to document something? You always have to keep in mind who is your audience. Is it young people? Do you make video to convince policymakers, or you want to educate professionals about new intervention? It's always very important to see what is the setting of your video. And of course, last but not least, the promotion of your video is very important. If you produce a video but nobody watches it, then that's not very useful. So you have to put equal effort on distributing your videos through social media and other communication channels to reach out as many people as you wish. Of course, you can also organize screenings, public screenings, where people can discuss your videos. Oops. So what video advocacy is good for? So you can document abuse of drugs, abuse of human rights abuses as well with videos. You can also mobilize people for a cause if you want people to send letters or sign a petition or whatever. Videos are also good to give voice to the vulnerable people who usually, don't get the possibility to tell their own stories in the media, in the mainstream media. So you can give them the voice to tell their own stories. You can make, for example, public health system more transparent, so you can help to identify problems in systems. You can show good practices. For example, from other countries, you can show what works in treatment, in prevention, in harm reduction. Videos can be also used to raise funds for NGOs. I will show you an example of that. And of course, education is also an important goal. For example, many of our videos now are used at universities as part of the curricula to, highlight important issues of drug policy. So one example of educational video we made is about overdose prevention. It's an animation video. When you want to target young people, animation is a very effective tool, especially if you use humor in it, and you can embed your message in a simple story. For example, in this case, we told a story of two animal figures, and through this story we explained what should you do when you find someone overdosed, how can you save lives of your loved ones if you find him or her overdosed by opiate. And yesterday the panelists mentioned that one way to prevent overdose deaths is to distribute naloxone, which is an antidote of the opioid overdose. And another example to video advocacy is films can be used for fundraising. For example, we helped a Russian organization called the Andrei Rilkov Foundation. In Russia, the Andrei Rilkov Foundation is the only NGO that is providing counseling, street outreach, and sterile needles in the streets of Moscow for drug users. And unfortunately, the government does not support this NGO. They only depend on international donors, and they launched a fundraising campaign on an internet website that's called Global Giving, where NGOs can launch their fundraising projects, so even people from the US can send money on your project. And videos are a very useful tool to introduce people in a few minutes to the cause of your organization. So we went to Moscow and we produced a promotional video for this small NGO to help them to raise funds. And now I will show you the trailer, the short version of this video. Thank you.
Что касается эпидемии ВИЧ-инфекции в России, она продолжает развиваться. По оценкам UNAIDS эта цифра может приближаться к 1 миллиону или 1,5 миллиона. Правительство российское оно не предпринимает буквально вообще никаких шагов для профилактики ВИЧ-инфекции.
Болезнь и заносит себе грязь, наш пользуется старыми шприцами.
В Москве, например, да, сейчас работает только один проект снижения вреда, это наш проект.
Миссия нашей организации – это способствовать развитию гуманной наркополитики, основанной на соблюдении прав человека и достоинства человека.
Фонд Андрея Рылькова помогает людям выжить.
Мы можем делать программу игл и шприцев в Москве. Несмотря на то, что 15 лет нам твердили о том, что это невозможно, но мы это делаем.
Я работаю непосредственно outreach-работником, раздаю шприцы и устанавливаю связь с людьми.
Для меня ценно помогать людям.
Провожу тренинги там по передозам, по ВИЧ. Я помню, как снижение вреда помогло мне, и, возможно, не будь в моей жизни снижения вреда, меня как бы не было бы уже здесь.
У нас ситуация постнадежда, пост какое-то сопротивление. Мы не пытаемся там поставить себя в оппозицию с правительством. Все, что мы хотим, это защищать жизни своих друзей. Все. Кого мы можем своими руками вытащить, того мы будем вытаскивать.
So you can watch the full movie, which is like 20 minutes. There is a longer documentary about this, the work of this organization. You can find it on our website, Drug Reporter. And this organization has already collected like $20,000 through this global giving website. They are collecting money to buy a mobile van to make street outreach in the streets of Moscow. So I also recommend you to visit their website and give some donation for them. Another example of how important harm reduction is Romania. For example, in a previous session, there was a lot of, it was about new psychoactive substances. And in Romania, after 2009, there was a switch in the drug market. A lot of people who injected heroin and amphetamine before, they started to inject new psychoactive substances, stimulant drugs like methadone and other kind of new stimulant drugs. The problem is that all these drugs are injected much more frequently than, for example, heroin. So a heroin user injects like 3 or 4 times a day, but these drugs were injected like 10 or 15 times a day. So that means that drug users needed much more needles, and they shared their needles much more often. And this change in the drug market just happened after the financial crisis. And because of financial austerity measures, the government cut down the budget for harm reduction programs. So in 2009, it was 2 million sterile needles distributed, and in 2010, only half of that. And now there is a rapidly growing HIV epidemic in Romania. Before 2009, there was only a few cases of HIV among drug users. Now there are hundreds of new cases. And you should know that treating HIV is much, much more expensive than to prevent HIV. So prevention is always much cheaper investment for any government than later paying for the antiretroviral drugs of people living with HIV/AIDS. So we worked together with a Romanian NGO and we launched a campaign. This is Stop the HIV Epidemic in Romania. This was targeting people not only in Romania but also Europe to show that now it's this kind of infections, HIV epidemic is spreading to many other countries. Yesterday we could hear the example of Greece. In Greece there is also a big HIV epidemic now. In Bulgaria it's happening too. In my country we also have many new HIV cases. So this is now a really significant issue. And governments must invest into harm reduction programs to stop this epidemic. In Serbia, we just produced a video last year. Serbia is also a good example that all harm reduction programs were funded by the Global Fund, but the Global Fund is now leaving Serbia. We produced a video in Belgrade showing how vulnerable, mostly Roma injecting drug users live in settlements of Belgrade. You can also find this video on our website. And what we also do besides producing videos, now we train other people, other activists and NGOs how to produce videos, how to use the camera. how to edit the videos, how to use the editing softwares, and we make video advocacy trainings for NGO people. So if you are interested in any kind of collaboration, if you work for an NGO and you want to be trained to use videos, then please let me know after the presentation, because we have video advocacy trainings in Budapest and in other countries too. Thank you very much for your attention.